running. It was all I could think about. The forest around me was a blur of twisted branches and shadows, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But I couldn't stop. Not now, not with that thing chasing me. It all started as a dare, something that should have been a harmless test of bravery. I mean, who would actually believe the stories about the forest demon? It was just one of those urban legends kids in small towns like ours passed around to keep things interesting. A creepy tale to tell around campfires. But standing here, in the middle of these dark, endless woods, I knew this was no legend. It was supposed to be a quick trip, in and out. I would run to the old cabin deep in the forest, grab a stupid trinket my friends had left there, and bring it back as proof. Easy. Except it wasn't. The moment I stepped off the trail and into the thick, untamed part of the woods, I felt it. A heavy, suffocating presence, like the air itself was thicker here, pressing down on me. I laughed it off at first, telling myself it was just nerves, but the unease only grew stronger with every step I took. The trees around me seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. I tried to keep my flashlight steady, but my hands were shaking too much. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. It felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes hidden in every shadow, tracking my every move. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It came again, closer this time. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark, tangled undergrowth. But then, from the shadows, it emerged. It was massive, far bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. Its body was a twisted, grotesque blend of fur and muscle, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, as if it had been stretched out beyond its natural form. And its eyes, they were the worst part. Glowing a sickly yellow, they locked onto me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped against my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. My feet pounded against the forest floor, but the creature was faster. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. I pushed myself harder, faster than I'd ever run in my life. My mind was a whirl of panic, of desperate prayers that I'd somehow outrun it, that I'd find a way out of these cursed woods. But deep down, I knew it was hopeless. The forest was a labyrinth, and I was trapped in its heart. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root hidden beneath the fallen leaves. I went down hard, the air knocked out of my lungs as I hit the ground. For a moment, everything was a blur of pain and confusion. I tried to get up, but my ankle throbbed with a sharp, searing pain. I'd twisted it badly, maybe even broken it. The creature's growl was louder now, so close I could almost feel its breath on my neck. I scrambled to my feet, limping forward, but I knew I couldn't outrun it anymore. The trees around me seemed to spin, disorienting me further. There was no clear path, no way out, just endless darkness and the sound of my own ragged breaths. I fell again, this time over a large rock. My head hit the ground hard, stars exploding in my vision. Dazed, I tried to crawl forward, my fingers digging into the cold, damp earth. But it was no use. The creature was upon me. I could hear it now, just behind me, its footsteps heavy, its growls low and menacing. I rolled over onto my back, staring up at the dark canopy of trees. The world was spinning, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. This was it. The end. The last thing I saw was its eyes, those glowing, hungry eyes, as it loomed over me. There was no time to scream, no time to beg for mercy. The creature struck and pain exploded through my body, so intense that everything else faded away. The forest, the darkness, the fear, it all disappeared into a numbing blackness. They found my body the next morning, deep in the woods, far off any trail. The search party had been out all night, and when they finally discovered me, they said it looked like I'd been mauled by a wild animal. But the look in their eyes told me they didn't believe that for a second. They saw the same thing I had, the unnatural, unexplainable horror that had chased me down. They never found the creature, but the stories about the forest demons spread like wildfire. People stayed away from those woods after dark, and even during the day there was a tension in the air, a fear that lingered just beneath the surface. But I knew the truth. The forest demon wasn't just a story, it was real, and it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And if you ever find yourself in those woods at night, remember my story. Because if you hear a low growl behind you, if you feel eyes watching you from the darkness, run. Run as fast as you can, but know that you might not escape, just like I didn't. I had never believed in ghosts. They were just stories, tales told to scare children or entertain bored adults. But that all changed the night I got lost in Ravenswood Manor. My name is Lily, and I was 16 when my parents decided to move our family to a small, sleepy town, far from the bustling city I had always called home. The reason? They had inherited an old mansion from a distant relative, a place called Ravenswood Manor. My mom and dad were thrilled about the idea of living in a grand, historic house. I was less enthusiastic. Moving to a new town, leaving behind my friends, and living in some ancient, creaky house wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. Ravenswood Manor was enormous, a towering Gothic structure with ivy creeping up its stone walls and tall windows that seemed to watch you as you approached. The locals avoided the place, and though they didn't say much, I could sense the unease whenever we mentioned the manor. My parents brushed it off as small-town superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about our new home. We moved in on a crisp autumn day, the leaves crunching underfoot as we unpacked the moving truck. Inside, the house was even more imposing. The ceilings were high, with dark wooden beams crisscrossing above. The floors were polished hardwood, creaking under our footsteps, and the walls were lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes following us as we moved from room to room. My parents were ecstatic, talking excitedly about restoring the manor to its former glory. I, on the other hand, felt uneasy. There was a coldness to the house, a chill that seeped into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the house seemed to groan and creak with every gust. I tossed and turned, pulling the blankets tighter around me, but sleep wouldn't come. Finally, I decided to get up and explore the house. Maybe I could tire myself out enough to finally drift off. I grabbed my phone and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my parents. The hallway outside my room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. The shadows were long and twisted, dancing on the walls as the wind outside whipped through the trees. I made my way down the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The house was a maze, with narrow corridors that twisted and turned, leading to rooms that seemed to serve no purpose. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was lurking just out of sight. I reached the ground floor and wandered through the darkened rooms. The furniture was old, covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. I wandered into a room I hadn't seen before, a large parlor with an enormous fireplace and tall windows that looked out onto the overgrown garden. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, and I shivered as I stepped inside. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the window, her back to me, her long dark hair cascading down her back. She was dressed in a flowing white gown that looked like it belonged to another century, and her hands were clasped in front of her. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone else in the house, and my parents were supposed to be asleep. So who was this woman? "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" She didn't respond. Slowly she turned to face me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Her lips were drawn into a thin, bloodless line, and there was a cold, malevolent air about her. "I've been waiting," she whispered, her voice soft but chilling. "So long, for someone like you." I took a step back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. She couldn't be real. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get away from her as fast as I could. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression darkened, and she took a step toward me. "I want what was taken from me. And now, you'll give it to me." I didn't wait to find out what she meant. I turned and bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear her footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, but somehow always close, no matter how fast I ran. The house seemed to twist and turn around me, the hallways stretching on forever as I tried to find my way back to my room. Every door I tried was locked, the handles cold and unyielding under my desperate hands. The house was a maze, and I was trapped in it with no way out. I could feel her presence behind me, getting closer with every passing second. Her cold breath on the back of my neck, her whispered words seeping into my mind. "You can't run from me, child. You're mine now." I burst into a room at the end of the hallway, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled to lock it, the key turning with a loud click. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. But the room was empty, save for a large mirror that covered one wall. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something wrong. The room behind me in the mirror wasn't the room I was in. It was the parlor, the one where I had first seen her. And in the mirror she was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just an empty room and the sound of my own ragged breathing. But when I looked back at the mirror, she was closer, her hand reaching out toward me, her fingers long and bony, tipped with sharp nails. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was solid behind me, and the door wouldn't budge. She stepped out of the mirror, her hand cold as ice as it wrapped around my wrist. Her grip was like iron, and I couldn't pull away. "You can't escape," she whispered, her breath icy against my skin. "No one ever does." I struggled, my heart racing, but it was like trying to fight off a nightmare. Her grip tightened, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, spreading through my body like a poison. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Let me go." But she only smiled, a cruel, twisted smile, as she pulled me closer. "You're mine now, child. Forever." And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed, the morning light streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a horrible dream, but the bruises on my wrist, the cold, lingering fear in my chest, told me otherwise. I never told my parents what happened that night. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. We stayed in Ravenswood Manor for another year before my parents decided it was too much work to restore and put it up for sale. I was relieved to leave, but I knew I'd never forget what happened in that house. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still feel her cold fingers around my wrist, hear her whispering in the darkness. And I know, deep down, that no matter where I go, she's still waiting. Waiting for me to come back, waiting to finish what she started. The name's Tom Baker, and I've seen some strange things in my 45 years, but nothing compares to what happened to me at the old Crowley Mansion. I'm just a regular guy from Cincinnati, work as an insurance adjuster, married with 2 kids. Never believed in ghosts or any of that supernatural mumbo-jumbo. Well, at least I didn't until that night. It all started when my company sent me to assess the Crowley Mansion for a potential buyer. The place had been abandoned for decades, ever since the Crowley family tragedy back in the 60s. I'd heard stories about the place growing up, whispers about old man Crowley going crazy and offing his whole family before taking his own life. But hey, that's just small-town gossip, right? I arrived at the mansion just as the sun was setting. The place was massive, 3 stories of Victorian grandeur gone to seed. Ivy crawled up the walls and the windows stared out like dead eyes. I'll admit, I felt a chill as I walked up to the front door, but I chalked it up to the autumn wind. The realtor was supposed to meet me there, but no one was around. The door was unlocked, so I figured they must be inside. I stepped into the foyer and, man, it was like stepping back in time. Dust-covered furniture, old paintings on the walls, even a grandfather clock that somehow still ticked away in the corner. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. Just the echo of my voice bouncing off the walls. I decided to start my assessment while I waited. The first floor was impressive, a grand living room, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20. But as I walked from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the air was too thick or the shadows were a little too dark. I headed up to the second floor. That's when things started getting weird. I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. And the temperature kept dropping. I could see my breath in some of the rooms. It was in the master bedroom that I first saw him. I was examining an old wardrobe when I caught a reflection in the mirror. A man, dressed in clothes from another era, standing right behind me. His face was twisted in a look of pure hatred. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. I told myself I was just seeing things. Too many horror movies, you know? But then I heard his voice, clear as day. "Get out of my house." I ran, tried to anyway. But somehow I couldn't find the stairs. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, doors opening into rooms I swear I'd already been in. It was like the house itself was changing, trying to keep me trapped. And all the while I kept catching glimpses of him, in windows, in mirrors, always with that same hateful look. Sometimes he'd be holding an axe, other times a rope fashioned into a noose. And always, always that voice. "You don't belong here. This is my house, my family." I don't know how long I wandered those halls. Hours, maybe. I found myself in rooms that couldn't possibly exist. A nursery where the toys moved on their own, a kitchen where the faucets ran with what looked horribly like blood. Finally, I ended up back in the foyer. The front door was right there, my escape just feet away. But he was there too, old man Crowley, standing between me and freedom. "You've seen too much," he said, his voice like gravel. "You'll have to join us now." That's when I saw them, the ghosts of his family, his wife, his children, all with the same empty eyes and sorrowful expressions. They reached out to me, their hands passing through my skin and chilling me to the bone. I don't remember how I got out. I have flashes, running, the ghost's howls of rage, the front door splintering as I crashed through it. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, speeding down the driveway. I quit my job the next day. Couldn't handle the thought of ever stepping foot in another empty house. My wife says I haven't been the same since, and she's right. How can I be, knowing what's out there? The Crowley Mansion still stands as far as I know. Sometimes I drive by it just to make sure it's real. And every time I swear I can see old man Crowley watching me from the upstairs window, waiting for me to come back. So that's my story. Believe it or don't. It's up to you. But take my advice. If you ever find yourself in an old empty house and you start feeling like something's watching you, don't look in the mirrors. You might not like what you see looking back.